A teenager, recently abandoned by her father, meets a kindred spirit while traveling through the Midwest in search of her birth mother. He decides to accompany her on the journey, and they fall in love as they learn to accept the part of their identities that burdens them with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. In 1988 Virginia, Maren yearly plays the piano in the auditorium when her friend, Sherry, invites her to a sleepover. Maren declines since her father won't let her, but Sherry tells her to sneak out after he's fallen asleep. After school, her father, Frank, picks her up and lets her drive back to their house. That night, before she sneaks out, Maren spots a sleepy Frank by the TV and stealthily grabs a screwdriver before going inside her room. He then gets up from the couch and bolts her door shut. Afterward, Maren slips out the window and makes her way to Sherry's house. She arrives, much to Sherry's delight, and mingles with her friends. Later, while Sherry and Jackie are busy trying on nail polishes, Maren and Kim lie underneath the coffee table and talk about their families. Maren inches closer to Kim and deeply inhales her scent. Sherry interrupts and asks Jackie to hold up her hand so she can paint her nails. Maren shares that she has no memories of her mother since Frank never talks about her. Kim then shows Maren her freshly painted nails when Maren suddenly bites her finger, scraping the flesh off. Seeing what Maren had done, Sherry drags her off the screaming teenager. Maren flees and returns home covered in blood. Frank is mortified but not surprised and tells her to pack her things quickly so they can leave before the police arrive. Soon, the pair are in Maryland and settle in a new home. Days later, just after Maren's 18th birthday, she wakes up all alone and finds some cash, her birth certificate, and a cassette tape on the kitchen table. On the tape, Frank explains that he's abandoned her because he can no longer help her and hopes she'll figure things out on her own. He's about to recount Maren's first cannibalistic episode when she quickly stops the tape and cries. Later, Maren checks her birth certificate and decides to head to Minnesota to search for her mother, Janelle. The following day, Maren goes to the bus station to ask for directions. However, she doesn't have enough cash for the whole trip and opts to travel until the third stop, Columbus, instead. In the bus, Maren continues the tape where Frank recounts how she chewed off her babysitter's face when she was a toddler. To evade the police, they had to change their last name and move away. Hours later, Maren arrives at the Columbus bus station, where she reads a book on a bench to pass the time. Moments later, it starts to rain, so Maren transfers to a roofed area for shelter. Suddenly, she spots a strange man approaching her. The man explains that he was able to smell her from afar and notes that she hasn't fed in months based on her scent. He then tells her to follow him, which Maren does, but conceals a rock in her person just in case. They stop at a house where he introduces himself as Sully and assures the frightened Maren that he won't eat her, as it's against his principles to feed on another eater. Sully leads her inside and prepares her dinner. Maren is shocked that other people like her exist, and he states that she must have unknowingly met a few in the past because they're drawn to each other by scent. Maren asks why he took her in, and he says he wanted to help her because she was hungry. Then, Maren picks up the house owner's scent and Sully pushes her to follow it and describe the smell. Maren then makes her way upstairs and is horrified to discover a dying elderly woman on the floor. Maren doesn't want to eat her and attempts to leave, believing she can control her urge. However, Sully explains from experience that the older eaters get, the more they need to feed, encouraging her to eat lest she do something terrible in her hunger. Sully then tells Maren that he didn't attack the old woman and simply found her in the current state. A morally confused Maren begins to cry and excuses herself, while Sully goes downstairs. The next morning, the woman finally takes her last breath and perishes. Maren then wakes to find Sully eating the woman's corpse and joins him. Afterward, Sully shows Maren a collection of his victim's hair which he's braided together into a long rope. Sully discloses that his grandfather was his first victim and that his mother protected him by blaming their animals. Sully then tells Maren that she can choose to stay and learn from him about their way of life, but she declines as she's still searching for her mother. As Sully cleans up, Maren quickly flees and catches the next bus. As the bus drives away, she spots a visibly dismayed Sully on the sidewalk. Later, she listens to the tape where Frank narrates her second kill when she was 8. He somehow knew that Maren was a predator and needed to do what she did, but he became increasingly anguished over the years when she never showed remorse for her actions. Soon, Maren makes her way to Indiana. While she shoplifts for supplies at a supermarket, she sees a woman being harassed by a male customer and calls him out. Lee backs her, provoking the man into a fight and leading him outside. Outside, Maren spots Lee covered in blood, having just eaten the man, and and informs her where he left the body in case she'd like to feed. As he's walking away, Maren tries to befriend him, but Lee seems disinterested. Eventually, Lee takes his victim's truck and offers to drive Maren to Minnesota after he realizes how little she knows about being an eater. They then make their way to the victim's house, where they spend the night. Maren sleeps with a knife in her hand and dreams of her father greeting her happy birthday. The following day, the pair eat at a diner, where Maren recounts her experience with Sully and describes him as creepy, cementing her reason not to stay with him. She then asks why Lee brought her along, and he says he thinks she's nice. Lee asks her the same question, but Maren doesn't answer, so he excuses himself to the bathroom. Meanwhile, a child stares intently at Maren, which she notices and growls playfully in return. Afterward, the two of them drive to Lee's hometown in Kentucky to visit his younger sister, Kayla. Soon, they arrive at his deceased aunt's house, where they plan to stay. Before leaving, he instructs Maren not to turn the electricity on as it might give their presence away. With Lee's permission to snoop around, Maren finds old photographs of a younger Lee. Later, Kayla, unaware of her brother's true nature, barges in and reprimands Lee for his prolonged absences, claiming he's becoming like their father. After their heated argument, Lee decides that they should leave Kentucky. Later that night, the pair go to Lee's old workplace, a slaughterhouse, to steal money. Lee then takes her to see the cows, where Maren reveals that she's going to Minnesota to find her mom. Lee warns that it might be a dead end, but decides to accompany her anyway, and later, they share a kiss. Soon, they arrive in Missouri, where Lee recounts his first flesh-eating experience with his babysitter, and Maren reveals her first was a babysitter as well. Moments later, two men named Jake and Brad approach the pair and introduce themselves as eaters, having smelled the pair by the river earlier. Afterward, Jake describes how he first met Brad and reveals that Brad isn't an eater and has voluntarily chosen to engage in cannibalism. Jake then informs them that his companion is yet to consume an entire body, bones and all, an experience he likens to feeding for the first time. However, Maren is disgusted by the revelation that someone would choose to eat people even if they don't have to, so she stomps away and locks herself in the truck, where she readies a knife. By the fire, Brad tells Lee that Maren is lucky to have him guide her. Jake disagrees and thinks it's Lee who needs help, despite looking like he has it together. Later that night, the pair attempt to drive away after the men have fallen asleep. However, Jake wakes up and tries to chase them, but the lovers manage to escape. They make their way to Iowa and stop at a local carnival. When Maren suddenly gets hungry, Lee spots a male worker at a milk can toss booth, flirts with him, and both men agree to meet after the worker's shift. While waiting for the booth worker's shift to end, Maren lets Lee listen to Frank's tape, where he concludes that he hopes his daughter will be able to stop her urges and be normal. Maren is despondent, but Lee assures her that Frank is wrong. She tries to ask him about his relationship with his dad, but Lee is elusive and only comments that it was terrible. They spot the male worker, so Lee gets out to meet him. Lee then leads the man to the cornfield suggestively, but slices his throat in the midst of the tryst. Maren searches for Lee, then finds him devouring the man before joining in. Afterward, Lee drives towards his victim's house, while Maren follows using the man's vehicle. However, Lee sees lights on in the house, so Maren volunteers to scout it out. To her horror, she discovers that the man had a wife and a newborn. When they see the man's family worried about him, they drive away quickly and leave the man's vehicle behind. Lee tries to explain that he didn't know the man had a family, but Maren's guilt continues to eat at her. She soon falls asleep and dreams of Frank. The next day, they arrive in Minnesota and locate her mother's house. She meets Barbara Kearns, her maternal grandmother, who tries to flee, but stops when Maren introduces herself as her granddaughter. Barbara leads Maren to the kitchen, where she affirms that they didn't know that Janelle had a child. She and her husband didn't allow her to marry Frank, causing her to run away. Barbara then informs her that Janelle is no longer with them, making Maren believe she's passed. She then shows her granddaughter pictures of a younger Janelle and reveals they adopted her as a baby after her birth parents abandoned her. Maren asks if Janelle ever hurt anyone, angering Barbara, who tells her to ask Janelle herself. Though initially hesitant, the older woman reveals that Janelle is alive and voluntarily admitted herself into a psychiatric hospital in Fergus Falls years ago. The pair then head to the mental institution, where Maren chooses to go inside alone. Maren asks the nurse if Janelle's dangerous, but the nurse assures her that she no longer is. She leads her to Janelle's room to meet with her heavily medicated mother, but is shocked to find that she'd eaten her own hands. The nurse hands Maren a letter that Janelle wrote 15 years ago in case her daughter finds her. Maren is horrified to learn that her mother is an eater as well, and chose to leave them in order to not risk hurting them. She adds that their kind isn't meant for love and are destined to be alone. Janelle apologizes for not being there for her and concludes with advice that Maren should off herself rather than live as a monster. After tearfully reading the letter, Janelle attacks and tries to bite her, but the nurse restrains the mother. As Maren runs away, Janelle screams for her to die. Maren returns to Lee and informs him of what happened. She becomes furious at Janelle for not staying, because having her mother would have made life easier for her. However, Lee counters that Janelle made the right choice, but Maren doesn't listen and decides to abstain from cannibalism because she refuses to go down the same path as her mother. Later, Maren stops at a gas station and runs away, leaving a sleeping Lee in the truck. Moments later, Lee discovers Maren is gone and goes to search for her the whole afternoon. The following day, as Maren walks along the highway, she's approached by Sully, who's been stalking her since Columbus. Maren is horrified, but Sully is unaware of her discomfort and offers she join him again. However, Maren refuses, causing Sully to angrily curse at her before driving away. Maren then goes to a local diner to eat, and she unravels the tape to destroy it. Elsewhere, Lee is asleep in his truck when he dreams of violently attacking someone. He then calls Kayla to inform her he's heading home and staying for a while, to his little sister's delight. However, she starts to wonder if something's wrong, noting the sadness in his voice, but Lee dismisses her worry. Months later, Maren makes her way back to Kentucky. She sees Kayla outside a store and asks about Lee's location. Kayla tells her that Lee now resides by the lake and has been hoping Maren shows up one day. Kayla reveals that their abusive father mysteriously disappeared one day after beating them up. Lee became the prime suspect because he was covered in blood, but was eventually released when the blood was confirmed to be his. After that incident, Lee started disappearing constantly. Maren then goes down to the lake to find Lee by the shore, and they share a hug. Later, while watching the fireworks, Maren suggests they travel westward, so the pair drive off to Nebraska the following day. The pair stop at an idyllic hill where Maren tells him that Kayla told her about their dad. However, Lee is hesitant to open up fully, but eventually relents, explaining that he found out their father was an eater when he tried to bite him during their scuffle. He tearfully confesses to hiding his father in a barn for 3 days before feeding on him. He wanted to take his own life, but kept going for Kayla's sake. Lee then asks Maren if he's a bad person, but she declares her love for him, and they passionately kiss. Maren suggests they keep driving and stay where the truck gives out. They decide to abstain from cannibalism to live a normal life together. Sometime later, the couple are settled in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they are blissfully happy living ordinary lives. One day, she returns home and is horrified to discover Sully has broken into their apartment. The older man holds her down on the bed, threatening her at knife point. Sully explains that after leaving her in Minnesota, he felt he had some unfinished business with Maren because she was the only one he's ever bonded with. Maren then tries to reassure Sully she won't tell anyone about him and reminds him of his promise of not eating fellow eaters. However, he reveals it was just a lie to get close to her because he was desperate for a companion and hoped it would be her. Maren then sees Lee enter the apartment and attempts to keep Sully distracted. Lee holds a plastic bag over Sully's head to suffocate him, while Maren stabs the older man repeatedly. They then drag his body to the bathtub, where Maren inserts her hand into the incision to pull out his organs, ending his life. Maren searches through Sully's bag and finds Kayla's blonde hair in his collection. She realizes Sully ate her after interrogating for their whereabouts. She's about to inform Lee, but sees that he's been fatally wounded from the struggle. Lee spots Kayla's hair and asks if he's a bad person. Maren tries to get him up to go to the ER. However, Lee is too weak and requests for Maren to eat him, bones and all. Maren cries and vehemently refuses at first, but Lee locks her in a passionate kiss and begs her to feed. She eventually complies and eats him during his last moments of life. Maren is then taken back to that idyllic hell where they first declared their love for each other.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.